Arnold Schwarzenegger is not just a name. He is living proof that greatness can be forged out of pain, unshakable discipline, and a vision so relentless it could cut through the darkest nights. He was not born into luxury, but into scarcity, in the tiny Austrian village of Thal, still scarred by the ruins of World War II. The streets carried silence heavier than words, and the homes echoed with the weight of loss. His family lived in a modest house, stripped of comfort. Winters were bitter, and warmth wasn't given freely. It had to be fought for. His father, Gustav, a strict police officer hardened by his own past, ruled the household with cold authority. Praise was rare, affection even rarer. The golden child was his older brother, Meinhard, who seemed to effortlessly win their father's approval. Arnold, by contrast, lived in the shadows, quiet, overlooked, aching not from punishment, but from the deeper wound of being unseen. Yet within that silence, a fire was born, a fierce, unquenchable hunger to prove himself. Love wasn't handed out in our house, Arnold would recall years later. You had to earn it, and even then, you might not get it. There was no gym in Thal, no polished equipment, no mentor. What Arnold had were scraps of metal, old pieces of wood, and a damp cellar that smelled of earth and rust. And in that cold, dimly lit space, he began not just shaping his body but forging his destiny. Every improvised weight he lifted was a silent declaration. I am here. I matter. While other boys played outside, Arnold stayed underground, sweat dripping onto concrete, eyes fixed on the magazine cutouts taped to his wall. Images of bodybuilders who to him weren't just strong, but free from smallness, free from invisibility, free from the life he refused to accept. He studied their poses as if they were sacred scriptures, memorizing every line and angle of the human form. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. And in those years, Arnold built more than muscle. He built an iron will, a discipline sharper than pain, and the unshakable belief that he could lift himself out of obscurity. It was in that cellar, with nothing but determination and the echo of clanging metal, that a legend quietly began to take shape. In 1968, at just 21 years old, Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped off a plane in America. To many, the United States was the land of opportunity. But for Arnold, it was not golden streets or instant glory waiting for him. It was a battlefield. He carried with him a small suitcase, a handful of dollars, and a dream far too heavy for the thin wallet in his pocket. His thick Austrian accent wrapped around every English word like chains, making even simple conversations a struggle. People often smiled politely when he spoke, but many could not understand him. I didn't know the words, Arnold later said, so I spoke with my actions. And his actions spoke louder than anything. By day he worked construction, hauling bricks, mixing cement, swinging hammers under the burning California sun. His hands blistered, his back ached, but every dollar he saved was a brick in the future he was determined to build. By night, he trained in dim, crowded gyms, where the smell of sweat and iron was his sanctuary. There he sculpted his body into something the world could not ignore. Home was often a small shared room, just a bed, a flickering lamp, and a cracked ceiling that stared back at him as he lay awake, wondering if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. At the time, bodybuilding was still seen as a strange fringe obsession in America. To most, Arnold was nothing more than an over-muscled foreigner chasing an impossible fantasy. But he knew the only way to silence doubt was to win, and to keep winning until the world had no choice but to notice. And win he did. In 1970, at just 23 years old, Arnold became the youngest man ever to claim the title of Mr. Olympia. It was not just a victory, it was survival. If I lost, he said, I wasn't just losing a trophy. I was losing my place in this country. Each title carried with it immense pressure. Every competition was not about glory. It was about belonging, about proving that he deserved to stay. The loneliness often cut sharper than the physical strain. Thousands of miles from Thal, Austria, he missed his mother's cooking, the rolling hills of his homeland, even the stern voice of his father. There were no arms to fall into, no family to soften the weight of his pursuit. America was fast, loud, and unyielding. His only companions were those who understood the silent language of the gym, men who shared the pain, the drive, the obsession. But when the weight stopped clanging and the gym lights went dark, the silence returned. And his body, too, demanded a price. Torn muscles, aching joints, deep bruises. These were not badges of honor, but warnings. Yet he pressed on. Pain became his currency, traded daily for a chance at the future he envisioned. Arnold refused to retreat. He burned the bridge back to Austria the moment he left. For him, there was only forward. Through every setback, he clung to one vision: the day when the world could no longer overlook him. I saw myself where I wanted to be, not where I was, he would later reflect. And with that unshakable vision, the lonely foreigner who arrived with nothing began to carve his name into history. By the early 1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was no longer the unknown foreigner renting a cramped room in Los Angeles. He had become the face of bodybuilding. In 1970, he claimed his first Mr. Olympia title at just 23 years old. By 1975, he had already lifted the crown 6 times. In 1980, his 7th victory sealed his status as a legend. But behind the dazzling trophies and roaring applause, there was a truth few ever saw. Every win came with a heavier burden. Maintaining a body sculpted to near mythical perfection meant training through relentless pain, hiding injuries, and living with the constant fear that one mistake, a torn tendon, a slipped joint, could end everything. Winning makes you a target, Arnold would later say. Everyone is waiting for the day you slip. And then Hollywood came calling. In 1982, Conan the Barbarian turned Arnold from a sports icon into a rising movie star. But even here, the climb was steep. Studio executives mocked his accent, saying it was too thick, too foreign. They said his last name was too long, too strange for a movie poster. Roles were scarce, rejection constant. But Arnold had been forged in rejection before. He studied acting, sharpened his delivery, and refused to yield. And when the Terminator hit theaters in 1984, the very accent they once ridiculed became his signature. His line, "I'll be back," echoed across the globe, cementing him not just as a star, but as a force. Yet fame, like muscle, comes with its own cost. Film schedules were merciless. Months spent on location, far from family, far from home. He had wealth, influence, recognition beyond anything he had dreamed as a boy in Thal. And yet, in the quiet of hotel rooms, after the lights and cameras faded, Arnold often felt the same loneliness he had known as a young man in Los Angeles, and fame magnified every stumble. A movie that underperformed, a personal misstep. Even the smallest failure was headline news because he was no longer just Arnold. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Success had built him a throne, but it also made him a prisoner of expectation. The same spotlight that lit his triumphs could just as easily expose his flaws. Then came choices that tested him in ways no dumbbell or camera ever had. Retiring from competition to focus on acting. Leaving behind movie stardom to enter the unpredictable arena of politics in the early 2000s. Each move drew critics who mocked his ambition, questioned his ability, and asked if he had the right to even try. But Arnold embraced the risk. "If you don't keep moving forward, you start moving backward," he once said. From the outside, it all looked like glory. 7 Mr. Olympia titles, box office triumphs, and the governorship of California. But those who looked closer saw the truth. At the top, the air is thin, the nights are long, and even the strongest man is still, in many ways, alone. For decades, Arnold's body was his fortress, unyielding under the lights of Mr. Olympia, unstoppable on Hollywood sets, and unbreakable in the brutal world of politics. It had carried him across continents, lifted him to power, and shielded him from storms that would have crushed lesser men. But in 1997, at 50 years old, that fortress cracked. Under the sterile glow of hospital lights in Los Angeles, Arnold lay on an operating table, stripped of the aura of invincibility he had carried for decades. Surgeons prepared to replace the aortic valve he had been born with, a condition he had hidden for half a century. For a man who had built his life on control, this was his most terrifying moment. I wasn't the Terminator, I wasn't the governor, I wasn't Mr. Olympia, I was just a man, he later admitted. Vulnerable, fragile, mortal. He didn't even tell his aging mother back in Austria, not wanting to place another burden on her shoulders. I'll call her when it's over, he told himself. But in 1999, she passed away, never knowing, never hearing that call. The scar on his chest eventually faded. The scar in his heart never did. Still, as always, Arnold pressed forward. Through the 2000s, he stood on red carpets, delivered political speeches, and carried himself as though nothing had changed. To the world, he still looked like the machine. But inside he knew. His body whispered reminders that one day it would betray him again. And it did. In March 2018, at 70 years old, what should have been a routine valve procedure spiraled into an emergency open-heart surgery. When he woke, confused and restrained, the doctors told him, "We made a mistake." For a man who had spent his life mastering control, this was a private hell. He thought of his children. Would they remember him as strong, or remember this? He thought of Maria. Did she still care? He thought of the press. What would they write? And haunting him most was the memory of his mother's death, leaving her without a goodbye. He feared his own children might carry that same wound. In October 2020, at 72, he faced his third heart surgery. By then, there were no more questions of why me, no bargaining, no denial, only acceptance. He nodded to the doctors, wordless, acknowledging that resistance against time was useless. Then came March 2024. At 76, still lifting weights, still smiling for cameras, still inspiring millions, Arnold's heart faltered again. Arrhythmia. Scar tissue from decades of surgery scrambled the rhythm that had carried him through every battle. The solution, a pacemaker. For most, it was a lifeline. For Arnold, it was a verdict. "I used to be the machine," he whispered to his doctor. "Now I need one inside me." Days later, he went public on his podcast, Arnold's Pump Club. On the surface, it was about raising awareness. But those who listened closely heard something deeper. The fatigue of a warrior who had survived too many battles. And the quiet surrender that comes when you realize the war will never truly end. Less than a week after the surgery, he stood on stage at an environmental summit. Cameras flashed, applause thundered. He smiled, charming as always. But beneath his tailored suit was a fresh scar, a hidden pacemaker, and a man who now measured every breath against the ticking inside his chest. For the first time in his life, Arnold's mornings no longer began with checking his muscles in the mirror. They began with pressing his hand against his chest, not to feel strength, but to feel the quiet mechanical pulse that kept him alive. The man who once conquered the world with iron fists and unbreakable will now faced the hardest truth of all, that no one, not even Arnold Schwarzenegger, is invincible. Sometimes the pain that cuts the deepest doesn't come from surgery scars or the terror of a failing heartbeat. It comes from watching someone you love disappear while their body is still standing before you. The world saw Arnold Schwarzenegger as a titan of strength, a man carved from iron and willpower. But no weight he ever lifted could stop the moment he looked into his father-in-law's eyes and realized the man he admired was already gone. It began quietly in the early 2000s. Sergeant Shriver, the proud American diplomat, co-founder of the Peace Corps, husband to Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and a man Arnold considered a second father, began to falter. At first it was small things: misplaced keys, repeating stories, forgetting names mid-sentence. Arnold noticed, and his chest tightened. He had seen these signs before in Austria. An uncle who had faded into dementia the same way, and he knew what was coming. As the years passed, the decline quickened. The man who had once stood before presidents, inspired millions, and shaped Arnold's own moral compass now drifted through rooms like a ghost in his own life. Then came the day that carved a scar Arnold would never forget. It was a quiet afternoon. Sunlight fell softly across the room as Arnold leaned in, speaking gently, hoping for a spark of recognition. Instead, Sergeant looked at him, vacant, and asked the words that crushed him. "Who are you?" Arnold's throat closed. He couldn't answer, because in that moment, he understood. The man who had taught him dignity, discipline, and belief in service was gone. Not dead, but gone. And there is no grief sharper, no wound more bitter, than mourning someone who is still alive. Arnold would later admit in rare moments of vulnerability that this cut deeper than any surgery, deeper than heartbreak, deeper even than failure, because it forced him to confront a haunting question: what if one day I forget who I am too? Watching Sergeant fade became a cruel mirror. Every forgotten word, every blank stare, whispered a truth Arnold couldn't outlift, outwork, or outrun, that neither muscle, money, nor medals could protect him from the slow, merciless theft of memory. It haunted him in the quiet moments, in hotel rooms after speeches, on film sets between takes, and in the stillness of dawn before the world knew he was awake. Publicly, he held his composure. He praised Sargent's legacy, spoke of hope, and promised to fight for awareness. Privately, it became his new discipline. He overhauled his diet, studied research, added supplements, and practiced daily mental exercises, not to live longer, but to remember longer, because it wasn't death that terrified him. It was disappearing while still breathing. When Sargent passed away in 2011, Arnold stood at the podium to deliver the eulogy. Cameras captured the steady voice of the movie star, the governor, the icon. But what they didn't capture was the private moment afterward. Arnold sitting alone, staring at the empty chair where his father-in-law once sat, tall and proud, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. Maybe it was a promise. Maybe it was a prayer. That he would fight not just for strength, but for memory. That when his time came, the world would remember him before it forgot his name. For years, Arnold Schwarzenegger carried a truth so heavy it lived like a shadow inside his home. A truth that would one day explode and tear apart the foundation of the family he loved. In 1997, Arnold secretly fathered a child with Mildred Baina, the family's longtime housekeeper. Just weeks apart, Maria Shriver, his wife of more than a decade and the mother of his 4 children, gave birth to their youngest son, Christopher. 2 boys, born almost side by side, one acknowledged, the other hidden, both growing up under the same roof, yet worlds apart. For over a decade, the secret lingered in silence. But as Joseph, the son Arnold had with Mildred, grew, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. The broad shoulders, the stance, the unmistakable spark in his eyes. Maria noticed the similarities more than once, but love and trust blinded her to what her heart did not want to believe. Maria had stood by Arnold through every reinvention, bodybuilding, Hollywood, politics. She had sacrificed her own career, her privacy, and her peace to raise their children under the glare of the spotlight. She had been his partner in every battle, but this was the war she never knew she was fighting. In 2011, the truth finally broke free. Maria confronted Mildred, and the answer shattered her world. Arnold confessed without resistance. There were no excuses, no frantic lies, just the heavy truth he had carried in silence for years. For Maria, it was not just infidelity. It was betrayal at the deepest level, a fracture of trust, a humiliation made public as soon as the media devoured the story. Within days, Maria quietly moved out of their home. Soon after, the headlines exploded. The world dissected every detail. Strangers judged, commentators mocked. But beneath the noise was the real devastation. 4 children blindsided by their father's secret. And a teenage boy, Joseph, thrown into a storm of judgment he had never asked for. Arnold, stripped of control, did the only thing left to do. He acknowledged Joseph publicly and privately. He offered support, tried to build a relationship, and accepted the consequences of his silence. Maria, with dignity and grace, released a rare statement. This is painful and heartbreaking, but it is also part of life. For Arnold, shame became suffocating. This was not just a scandal. It was the moment he ceased to be the man his wife could lean on, the man his children could fully trust. He had built his empire on discipline and control. But here, in the one place he should have guarded most fiercely, he had failed. Years later, in an unflinching interview, he admitted, "There's no one else to blame. I caused this. I hurt the person I loved most, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life." And he meant it. Because behind the muscles, the fame, and the legend was now a man who would forever see the pain in Maria's eyes, who could never undo the distance that grew in his children's hearts. Some scars don't fade. Some mistakes don't vanish. They live with you quietly, relentlessly, every single day. When the truth erupted in 2011 and the foundation of his family collapsed, Arnold Schwarzenegger did not run to the cameras. He did not stage a teary talk show confession or plead for public forgiveness. Instead, he chose silence, not as escape, but as responsibility. In private, he admitted to a close confidant, "There's no one else to blame. I did this, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." It wasn't a crafted press release. It wasn't spin for headlines. It was the raw honesty of a man stripped bare. Maria Shriver, dignified, wounded, but resolute, moved forward with grace. Their 4 children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher, were shielded as much as possible from the chaos. And Arnold stepped into a different role, not the action hero, not the governor, but a man who now had to rebuild trust, one quiet day at a time. He did not turn away from Joseph, the son whose very existence had pulled the secret into the light. Instead, Arnold leaned in, brick by brick, building a bond through training sessions, long conversations, and the discipline of showing up. Joseph, once a boy in the shadows, grew into his father's mirror, strong, driven, and finally embraced. With his 4 other children, Arnold didn't demand forgiveness. He didn't try to erase the pain with grand gestures. He simply showed up. Birthdays, graduations, family dinners, quiet moments that mattered far more than headlines. And slowly, piece by piece, the walls began to mend. Professionally, he returned to film, but the hunger for fame that once burned so fiercely had softened. Now his work was more selective, his roles fewer, his purpose clearer. His true stage became causes larger than himself. He championed environmental initiatives, supported veterans, funded after-school programs, built outdoor fitness parks, and gave generously to Alzheimer's research in honor of Sergeant Shriver, the father-in-law he had lost to memory. These acts weren't designed for cameras. That was precisely the point. For Arnold, redemption was never about reclaiming the world's applause. It was about becoming a better man in the eyes of those he had hurt. In quiet moments at home, he would sometimes look at old photographs, smiles from a time before the fracture when his family felt whole. He rarely spoke when holding those memories, but those close to him knew his silence carried more weight than any apology ever could. "I built my life on discipline," he once said softly to a friend. "But this was the one place I lost it, and it cost me everything." He never remarried. Though his name occasionally surfaced alongside companions, Arnold never again stood before an altar. Some said it was loyalty, others penance. Perhaps it was simply an acknowledgement that he had once held something extraordinary and let it go. There was no grand Hollywood redemption arc, no sweeping finale, only a man in his 70s, standing beside his children, mentoring the next generation, carrying a scar that time would never erase. A scar that became both his burden and his compass. At 78, Arnold Schwarzenegger is no longer the indestructible figure crashing through fireballs on screen or posing under the blinding lights of Mr. Olympia. The muscles have softened, the stride has slowed, but the steel in his will remains. Most mornings still begin before sunrise at his Brentwood estate in Los Angeles, a Mediterranean-style villa he bought in 2002 for about $4.8 million, now worth between $20 and $30 million. Spread across 6 lush acres, the mansion is not just a home, but a fortress of memories. Floor-to-ceiling windows open to sweeping views of the Pacific. Dual kitchens serve family weekends. One warm and intimate for daily meals, the other sleek and sprawling for entertaining. There's a private theater, a wine cellar, a billiards lounge, and a resort-style pool surrounded by cabanas. In the garage, his life story is written in machines. A real M47 Patton tank from his Austrian military days. The original AM General Hummer H1 that started a global craze. A custom electric Hummer H1 and a modern EV version. A BMW i7, a Chevrolet Suburban, and a rare Excalibur Series 2. A Porsche 911 Turbo Cabriolet for sunset drives. And even, as some profiles note, a Bugatti Veyron Grand Sport. But the most important machine in Arnold's life today is the one inside his chest. His pacemaker, implanted in 2024, keeps a steady rhythm where nature has faltered. After 3 heart surgeries and decades of strain, he no longer measures himself by plates and reps. Now he measures by balance, longevity, and the discipline to stop before pain begins. Protein shakes have given way to plant-based meals. Daily meditation has replaced the ego of pushing past limits. In short fitness clips aimed at men his age, he proves that discipline can outlast vanity, even when muscle gives way to time. He never remarried after his 2011 split from Maria Shriver. For more than a decade, his partner has been Heather Milligan, a physical therapist who shares his quiet, steady life, far from the red carpets and flashing cameras. His children now carry their own legacies. Catherine, now a mother herself, often brings her kids by, allowing Arnold to embrace a gentler version of fatherhood. Patrick balances acting with entrepreneurship. Christina walks her own path, far from Hollywood's spotlight. Christopher stays grounded and private. And Joseph, once the boy in the shadows, is now fully embraced, bonded to his father through iron, resilience, and the unspoken vow to build forward without shame. Financially, Arnold has ascended into rare territory. In 2025, Forbes estimated his net worth at $1.2 billion, not by accident, but by discipline. From laying bricks with Franco Columbu in the 1970s, to buying apartment buildings at age 25, to launching the Arnold Sports Festival in 1989, his empire was built piece by piece. His fortune is not just trophies and film checks, it is vision, patience, and risk calculated like a workout plan. But perhaps his greatest investments now are not in wealth, but in people. He funds after-school programs, builds outdoor fitness parks, supports Alzheimer's research in memory of Sergeant Shriver, and advocates for veterans and the environment. There is no grand will made public, but those close to him say his affairs are meticulously arranged, another way of showing up for his family, even beyond his final day. Age has carved lines into his face. His stride is slower, but his handshake is firm, and his eyes still carry the spark of the boy from Thal, who once dreamed of escaping his small village. Strength, he has learned, is not about how hard you hit, but how steadily you stand. At graduations, on the sidelines of games, around quiet dinner tables, on morning bike rides through Brentwood, where each turn feels like a promise kept. If his mansion is a fortress, if his cars are battalions, then the true lesson of his late 70s is this: redemption is not loud. Legacy is not applause. And every quiet step forward counts, especially when the ticking inside your chest reminds you why you take it. Arnold's story is not merely about muscle, medals, or movies. It is the odyssey of a boy from Thal who once stared past the Austrian mountains and dared to dream of a life far larger than the one given to him. It is the story of a man who stumbled, who scarred, who failed, but who chose again and again to rise. And now, with a heart that has been opened, stitched, and mended, Arnold reminds us that true victories are not found in trophies or headlines. They are found in forgiveness, in discipline when no one is watching, and in the choice to keep moving forward, even when stillness would be easier. Because in the end, we are not born legends. We build ourselves into one, choice by choice, day by day.